So my earliest memories of Colorforms, I probably was somewhere between 4 and 6 years old. And I remember sitting alone in my bedroom with this box where you peel off the forms and shapes and manipulate them on this set, this background. And I just remember spending quite a long time in fantasy creating these little ideas. So composition, of course, is essential for a photographer and any artist, and Colorforms, I think, was probably a critical early experience in creating scenes, both in shape and form and design. So currently I spend a lot of time making sure that my scene looks great as far as where shapes are placed and whether the colors are consistent with the look that I want to put together. And I'm pretty sure that sitting as a little kid in my bedroom designing scenes for my Barbie correlates a lot to what I do today. As a photographer, my clients come in and I need to advise them on their clothing and accessories and how it looks within the scene, and I think there's a direct correlation between that and Colorforms. What I see in toys today is a lot of toys guide you into how you can use your creativity and how you actually use the product, but Colorforms had no directions, and I think that's so critical for a developing mind and a developing imagination to just take shapes and colors, or maybe Barbies, and let your imagination go flee.
I think like the biggest impact for me with Colorforms was the fact that they used licensed characters. And as a cartoonist, of course, now, I was completely inspired by those characters. Now there was this one Spider-Man one which I really liked too, but I have to say Batman was my first experience. But Spider-Man was cool too, and I remember Spider-Man was outside and was like a one-point perspective of a city. Not only was I drawing the characters and I had references of the characters, but I have references of like a one-point perspective of creating a city and creating a city scene. And you just kind of remember these kind of cliche things, because what they really did is they made these cities like ready for you to play in, not giving you too much information to like throw you out of the imagination, because that's the beauty of Colorforms, is that it takes imagination. You really have to fill in the blanks.
As a graphic designer, I think that playing with Colorforms definitely influenced me in that, you know, I used my imagination, I created ideas from simple forms. My earliest memory was going back to when I was in grammar school, and just the colors, the bright colors and the shapes, and how much fun it was to peel off the vinyl and stick it down. I think as a store owner, learning about spatial relationships, how colors work together, how shapes work together, I think it definitely had an influence on me. Colorforms helps to get an idea across with a minimal amount of information. So learning to make things out of just simple shapes and colors is a really good exercise for getting a concept across in the simplest possible way.
Years ago, I was in design and paste up and layout, and on a more than daily basis, I would think about Colorforms as I would take the hot wax text and lay it down and then reposition it and trim it and reposition it. And I really thought that between Colorforms and paper dolls, I was still doing the same thing I had done as a 6-year-old. My earliest memory of Colorforms is probably the Flintstone set. The way that Colorforms influences me most, and that continues from then, is the flexibility of taking the same forms and looking at them in a different arrangement. Just the other day, I was referencing Colorforms to my coworkers, saying, "Did you play with Colorforms as a kid? It's the perfect metaphor for what we're doing here." So I think that Colorforms, because you can take the same information and reposition it and recontextualize it, plays an enormous part in the way that I go through my day.
earliest memories of playing with color forms are lots of geometric shapes. I can remember creating, out of triangles and squares and circles, all sorts of things, and the discovery of what it felt like to picture something, a monster or a dragon or something out of those shapes. The fact that there were just these few shapes and that what I wanted to create had to be problem solved, I think is very much the roots of what it's like when you have parameters on a project and you have to use certain materials. Those are all part of manufacturing constraints for industrial design. Color forms, I think, really applies to using that part of the mind that knows what it wants, and has some sort of idea first, and then tries to represent it or make it happen with simple shapes. I think the abstraction of color forms at a young age is really important to get you to realize that idea of invention kind of stirs up, versus a feeling of trying to do something too accurately. So I think I can remember that feeling, and the open-endedness of it, of not knowing where you're going to go, but just following the intuition of what the shapes might look like. You knew that it could be undone easily. So as a little kid, and you're trying new things, I could still feel the feeling of peeling up and putting down shapes, things that were experimentation, and that, always still reminding myself that you gotta try things, a lot of trial and error, in order to sometimes not know where you're going, but see what happens. And I think what I feel about color forms were when there wasn't really a downside to trying something.
It was very simple in the elements, but you can make something very complex. And I can remember stacking things up like a pie, like a layer cake, and different combination. Because they were all primary colors, you were still putting these colors around in different ways. So in my early career, I was a theatrical set designer for theater and television. I co-founded a equity theater in Chicago, and then later I was a set designer for NBC. Color forms was part of creating my aesthetic, which was a simple instead of more aesthetic, and that's the idea that you can take basic shapes and create an impactful image. When you're working with a small equity house, not something on Broadway, you're really thinking about how do you reuse things, and so there's an ethic around color forms about reusing and taking that, maybe you created a window shape here and you can move it over here and do something different with it. It's the simplicity that I think of, just the refining it down, that is the big impact. In my current work, which is as a technologist, really, and I develop new products around technology. Yes, there's a linkage, but it probably would not be apparent to the naked eye between color forms and my current job. Not gilding the lily with products. Trying to really focus in on the essence of what it is that you're trying to communicate or trying to achieve is really the important piece of it. And that's true whether you're developing a technology for a consumer product or a business product, really.
It's more fun to play the Colorforms way.